Hi everyone, it's Lauren. I hope you're all doing really well. Today I wanted to talk about some of the authors that I would really like to read more of. So these are all people that I have read but one or two books of, and then for some reason, even if I really loved them, not sought out anymore. Not read any of their back catalogue, not read any of their new things. So I would like to talk about some of these authors and the books of theirs that I've read, what I enjoyed about them, and hopefully get some recommendations from you guys on what would be a really good book of theirs to pick up next. So number one on this list is Bernardin Evaristo. I, of course, read Girl, Woman, Other earlier this year and absolutely fell in love with it, as I know a lot of people did. I really loved the way she wrote all of these different women so vividly, and I loved the way all their characters and their stories wove together. I thought it was expertly done. And I would love to read more of her work. I am just one of those awful people who didn't know about her until she was shortlisted and won the Booker Prize. And I know she's written a lot more books that I haven't been aware of. So I really want to get going with her. Number two is Maggie Nelson, and I think this might be a bit of a difficult one because I don't think she's written that many books, but I read The Argonauts a few years ago by her, which obviously is non-fiction and just musings on her life and her relationship. But I really loved how she played with all these different philosophies and themes, and it just felt like such an impressive book. It's very small, but it just packs such a punch, and it has so many little bits in there that you just have to tease apart. And I know she's written Bluets and The Red Parts. Bluets is about the colour blue, I think, and The Red Parts is about her aunt who was murdered. I love the little question mark at the end of that sentence. I think that's what it's about. But yeah, I would love to read more of her work. Number three is Maxine Kingston, and I read her book The Woman Warrior a few years ago now, which is a sort of fictionalised but sort of autobiographical story of her growing up as a Chinese American daughter of immigrants. And I absolutely devoured that book, and I know that that's just like the first part in her autobiography, and she has then gone on to write more about her life. But for some reason I just thought, oh, that's a good book, and then never continued. Really strange behaviour, but I definitely want to read more of her. I thought it was so beautiful how she wove into her own tale, like these tales of Chinese fairy tales, myths and legends, and the sort of magical elements of storytelling within Chinese culture, and the way her mother particularly would think about and tell her own story to her daughter. It's just, there was so much that I enjoyed, and I don't know why I haven't continued reading her. Number four is Mélie de Kerangal, whose book Men the Living I read a few years ago, which was absolutely phenomenal. It's about the journey really of a heart and a boy who dies, and his heart is then used in a heart transplant, of course, and it's about all the different people that this death and this transplant touch. So him and his family, but then all of the people in the journey of the heart getting to its recipient, the doctors who deal with his body and who deal with the new patient. And it's fascinating and so careful, and the way it handles death and life and the line between those two things is just so beautiful. It's such a wonderful look at death, essentially, but also life. I found it so beautiful, and I know she's written more books, but I don't know how many have been translated into English. But I would nonetheless, if anybody has any recommendations for more of her books, I would be very grateful. Number five is James Baldwin, and I've read Giovanni's Room and also The Fire Next Time. Although when I did a video where I looked back at some of the top rated books on Goodreads that I have read, The Fire Next Time came up, and I realised I couldn't remember it properly. Or I remember a lot of the feeling of the book, but when it came to trying to describe it back to someone, I thought, oh God, like that has left my brain. So I definitely want to give that a reread, but especially because I remember really enjoying reading it at the time as well. I would just really like to read some more of him. Number six is Maya Angelou, someone else whose story I just for some reason stopped reading. I read I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings a few years ago. Really loved it. It's obviously an autobiographical tale of her growing up, and she has written more of her own story. Like, her story continues, but for some reason I just read that book and stopped and didn't read about the rest of her life. So I definitely want to continue that journey. Number seven on this list is Octavia E. Butler, and I read and thoroughly fell in love with Kindred last year, I think. And I feel like she generally writes more science fiction books, but Kindred felt like a mix of science fiction and historical fiction, really. But it just packed such a punch. But to be honest, it doesn't matter to me about genre. I'd be up for reading anything she's written, because I just loved the way the plot and the narrative was handled in Kindred, as well as combining all of the elements of like slave era and the relationships between the characters, the pace of the narrative as well. I just thought it was spectacular. Number 8 on this list is Michelle Faber, and I read The Crimson Petal and the White years ago, years and years ago. Really enjoyed it. It must have been around the time I think there was a TV adaptation with Romola Garai, which was a long while ago, and that's when I read the book. And then, again, completely forgot about him. And earlier this year, or it might have been late last year, I read Under the Skin, which I really enjoyed. It's very weird and bizarre and creepy, but it reminded me how much I enjoy his writing. So now I think, okay, I need to get back on this Michelle Faber horse and ride it towards some other books. Number 9 is Patricia A. McKillip, whose book Alphabet of Thorn I read last year, and I really loved. This was like a fantasy book, but standalone, which I think is just great, because sometimes when you want to read a fantasy, but you don't necessarily want to get dragged into a whole epic series. And I thought this was so well done. It's not even a very long book, but she did some really clever, very speedy world building, and the story felt full and you felt engaged, and the plot managed to resolve itself very quickly. And I just think that's really clever. But I do feel like she has a huge back catalogue of books, so I have no idea where to start. But if anyone else has read her or knows more about her in general, because they're more into the fantasy genre, like have more knowledge of that than I do, then I would really appreciate your guidance. And lastly, I would really like to read more of Toni Morrison. She's another author who I read like a few years ago and then just like stopped reading the rest of her work. So I picked up The Bluest Eye a few years ago now, really enjoyed it. And then that was it. Like, instead of thinking, oh, maybe I should read more of this author whose work I really like. And then end of last year, I read Beloved, really enjoyed it. I've recently bought Sula and I plan on reading that soon. But again, I want to read more. I want to try and read all of her if I can, as long as I'm still enjoying it, obviously. But I would love to hear from you guys which of her books you enjoyed the most. I feel like everyone has a kind of different favourite in her work, because it seems to me, as someone who's not read very much of her yet, that her work can be quite different. Like, some of it can be a lot more abstract than others. So yeah, I'm interested to go on that journey. Let me know in the comments which authors you really want to read more of. I hate to think of reading as a chore, especially when it's an author you really like. But also, there are just so many books and so many booktubers and so many book recommendations. Sometimes it's hard to remember like who you really enjoyed. Like, you might mean to read some more of one author and then just get distracted and end up reading other things. So I'd love to hear what your author goals are in terms of reading, and I will see you in my next video. Bye.